Good afternoon, everyone. This is Palvishay Bab. I am here with Community World Service Asia, and I'd like to formally welcome all of you to this webinar today. Thank you to all of you participants who registered and who are participating today. A very warm welcome to all of you from Community World Service Asia. I know that many of you may already be familiar with Community World Service Asia and what we do as an organization, but I'll give you a short introduction on the organization and this webinar and the series that it's a part of. And then I'll give the floor to the facilitator. I'm going to turn off the camera now. I just wanted to say hello to everybody, just so that there isn't any disruption in the communication. So Community World Service Asia is a humanitarian development organization. It's registered in Pakistan, and we aim to address factors that divide people by promoting inclusiveness, shared values, diversity, and interdependence. Community World Service Asia is highly committed towards accountability to affected people and people-centered aid. We're also chairing and hosting the Q&A hub, the ADRN Q&A regional hub in Asia. And over the last 2 years, we have offered different webinars covering various aspects on safeguarding and aiming to raise more awareness on key aspects of accountability, such as establishing efficient and transparent complaint systems and protection from and prevention of sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment. Safeguarding is a key pillar to any accountability measures that organizations must integrate into their programs and working cycle. This webinar is a part of a series of 6 one-hour webinars of this year's Q&A week that we are hosting in collaboration with other key partners on Q&A each year. This series focuses on safeguarding, key policies and minimum requirements, complaint systems, complaints handling, and managing investigations and communication. Today's webinar is the 3rd session in the part of this series. I believe some of you have already been part of the other sessions, and this is a continual learning process, and this is the 3rd session of those series. The goal today, I believe, is to ensure that participants understand essential components for establishing an efficient complaints and response mechanism. And we hope to have some productive discussions and explore challenges and solutions in relation to control response mechanisms. As part of the format, there will also be a panel discussion today. Now, as we move into towards the webinar and its content, I'd like to introduce your trainer and facilitator for today, Ms. Esther Dross. Ms. Dross is an independent consultant with over 25 years of experience and specialization in accountability, prevention of sexual exploitation and abuse, gender, and child protection. She has had an extensive exposure to humanitarian certification systems and accountability to affected populations while working with HAP International as a complaints handling and investigation advisor, and later as their certification manager. Recently, in the last 6 years, and since working as an independent consultant, Esther has been leading a pilot project for FAO on accountability and gender mainstreaming in emergencies, and working with numerous NGOs, including Act Alliance members, and supporting and training their staff on gender issues, child protection, and PSEH. We also have 2 panelists who will share their expertise and experiences on CRM today. We have with us Vermont Sira Aka. Vermont is the safeguarding focal point for Caritas in Central African Republic. And we have with us Ruby Moshenka. Ruby is the global SHEA and safeguarding lead on sexual harassment, exploitation, abuse, child abuse, and adult at-risk abuse for ActionAid International, and she's based in London. Thank you very much to Vermont and Ruby for joining us today. Before we start, I'd like to, I'm just going to go over the house rules.
Yeah, and I will share the house rules.
So today's webinar is scheduled for 1 hour, 60 minutes. It's a 60-minute webinar in total. Please stop your video for better connectivity, as I have, and all attendees will be muted by default. Submit your questions via the Q&A feature, which is here in Zoom. It is at the bottom of your screen. Use the chat feature to communicate with us, which is also at the bottom of the screen. We will be using the polling feature for some introductory questions, so please participate in those and fill in your answers. I'd also like to remind everybody that this webinar is recorded. Another important reminder is to let you all know about our complaints channel. So if there is any, if you have any complaints, you may email Community World Service Asia on this online form.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Palvashai, for this, and we're pleased to be with you today. Can I just say we've welcomed Vermont from from Central African Republic, but I think he is not online. He might have some connectivity issues, so hopefully he will join us later, and otherwise we'll have a smaller panel. Sorry for that, but we'll still try to cover, of course, interesting topics. So let us maybe, what I would like to do is maybe start with a little poll. As you know, this is part of a series of webinars, and we have already spent 2 sessions. Some of you have spent these 2 sessions with us on overall safeguarding questions, and another session specifically on what are the key requirements, the core issues we need to cover when we speak about safeguarding. So we've put together some questions just for you to very quickly tell us, to see what you remember and if you've been part of these 2 first sessions. So let me leave a couple of minutes to fill the poll in. Please do participate. So you have the poll on the screen, and you have 4 questions. The first one is simple yes or no if you have been part of our 2 first sessions. Then we'd like to know how you define safeguarding. You have multiple answers. You have to choose one, the one which fits best. We have then a question on core policies you need to have when we speak about safeguarding. And we have the question on what are the key core commitments when we speak about safeguarding. So we only have 4 out of 57 participants for the time being, so we'll give you a couple of more minutes. I know it's not always easy with connections, so let's give you 2 minutes more to click on the different answers. And maybe while you do that, also to tell you that we will share the presentation as usual with you after this seminar, and you will find additional information on the CWSA website with materials and other. And welcome to the ones joining now. Good, we'll soon have 50% of the attendees who have filled in the questions. So once we are at the 50%, I think we'll just comment a bit on your answers. Excellent. So happy to see that you are a majority of the respondents who did not participate in our first two series, but you can always watch them on the CWSA website if you want to see what we have been speaking about, as we will not necessarily go back to the content of those sessions in this webinar and the future webinars. How do you define safeguarding? A majority of you is telling me that safeguarding is the responsibility of an organization to ensure that their staff or operations do not harm adults or children. And that is actually the right definition. So obviously some of the other questions came close to, of course, you need to have a child protection policy and a code of conduct, but safeguarding is more than just having these two policies in place. It's a whole set of measures and policies, procedures, which ensure that our staff themselves do not harm the people they are in contact with. The core policies you need to have in place. I think most of the policies I have given you a choice of are important policies. But when we speak about safeguarding, the answer was actually the one which the majority of you have clicked. So what we need is a code of conduct, safeguarding policy, recruitment procedures. Obviously, staff manuals, HR handbooks, procurement policies, partner guidelines are all very important and should somehow link back to safeguarding as well. But the answer we were looking for was around code of conduct, safeguarding policy, and the recruitment procedures. And the last question, what is part of the key obligations and commitments? So definitely no sexual activity with children. That is a majority of you who have clicked this one. Prohibition to exchange services, money, humanitarian aid against sexual favors would be another of our core commitments. The obligation to create a safe environment, free of sexual exploitation, abuse and harassment, very important. And as well, maybe that was not very highly rated, but obligation to report suspicions or concerns would be also one of the key obligations. And the prohibition, and I don't know why we have that twice, prohibition of sexual relationship with beneficiaries, which is as well a core prohibition. So thanks a lot for having participated. So that's where we are in our discussion on safeguarding. Today we want to focus a bit more on what comes once we receive a complaint. So we want to focus on complaints systems. I hope you can see my screen. So the objective of our session today is really to understand what are the essential components for establishing an efficient complaints and response mechanism, and then discuss and explore challenges and practical solutions. So let me ask you, and you can use the chat function. Let me ask you how you define a complaints and response mechanism. If I'd ask you to define, we all talk about this, but what is it? Somebody wants to try a definition on the chat. Anybody? Okay, a tool that allows population to provide feedback on offered services, the right to ask and the responsibility to respond. Like that very much. Thank you, Sudin. A mechanism in which staff and beneficiaries can access to submit his or her complaints and get feedback. A formal mechanism for registering complaints. Lots of fantastic ideas. Mechanism enable stakeholders to safely raise a concern or make a complaint in respect of our work and to be assured that appropriate action will be undertaken. Excellent. Thank you, everybody. So yes, we certainly want to have, and it was in some of your answers, this is about a formal system. So it's sometimes complaints can of course come in informally, but what we want to ensure is at one point it becomes formal. So the system needs to be formal to ensure that we deal with all complaints in the same way. And certainly the idea of welcoming reception of complaints, welcoming complaints, remembering that complaining is a right. So we have a right to complain, and it's important that we welcome people's complaints. And as some of you said in your answers, obviously this is about handling, then it's not just about receiving the complaint, but the important word in the complaint and response mechanism is certainly the word response. So we have to handle these complaints efficiently and in a timely manner. Good, so this is what we talk about when we talk about the CRM. We all remember that what we need to have a robust CRM is really 4 essential pillars. First one is around accessibility. The system needs to be accessible in the widest sense, not just geographically accessible, but this is about technology, it's about language, it's about inclusiveness, it's about thinking through different possibilities for different groups of people who would like to complain. So accessibility is an important topic and not so easy to think about all the different accessibility problems people might face. Another important pillar is about transparency. So our system needs to be transparent. People need to know what this is about, what is the policy, what is the procedure, what happens once I have raised a complaint, who will see that complaint, who will deal with the complaint, who will give me an answer, what is the timelines, etc. So this needs to be a transparent process. At the same time, it needs to be a confidential process. Of course, identities of people who are whistleblowing, who are complaining, who even are then later maybe witnesses to an investigation, is confidential, and keeping confidentiality is really key to building trust with communities and people who potentially need to use our complaint system, that they trust they can do that in full confidentiality, and it will not be wildly known that you raised, for example, a complaint. And of course, the last, and by this I don't mean the less important, but the 4th pillar of our complaint system is around safety and security. The system needs to be safe for everybody, to be used without risk of retaliation or any other security issues people can face. And of course, thank you, Ahmed Salem, reminding us that awareness of the system to the program beneficiaries, of course, is key. So there we go back to transparency. People who are supposed to use this system need to be aware that it exists, need to be aware how it functions, need to be aware how to access it. And even wider than just our complaint system, need to be aware of what are the policies and the rules, the prohibitions and the obligations the organization has committed themselves to, which we have covered just before in the poll questions. So awareness raising is very important. sorry, the safety and security just dropped, but of course that shouldn't be. This is key. Good. We all know, and we've already spoken quite a lot about this in former sessions when we speak about safeguarding. We do have power imbalances, of course, in the communities themselves, but power imbalances between the communities and us, between us and maybe our donors, between us and the public. Lots of power imbalances are in place. And one of the things we need to take into account when we set up the system is this power imbalance, so that we can, by sharing knowledge, but also by sharing power, give more weight to the community, to the weaker, maybe the weaker side of the population, to enable them take the right and come forward with a complaint if there is an issue to be solved. We know that power is depending from a lot of things, and some of these issues we cannot do much about them. Issues around the status of the person, so economical status, for example, issues around privileges we have, about independence, about wealth, but also about access and ability to set values and norms, and knowledge. So lots of these different points which influence power imbalances are out of our own reach. Maybe as an organization, we cannot necessarily change the status or privileges from people, but what we can certainly influence is knowledge. So sharing, and it goes back to what Ahmed Salem said earlier, raising awareness with people, with different stakeholders on their rights, on our commitments, on requirements, on obligations, in a very transparent way, gives, and sharing the knowledge to know how to raise a complaint, that gives more power to people to actually use that right. But of course, the four issues I talked about before, confidentiality, access, transparency, and security, need to be well covered so that people do trust it can work. So sharing knowledge is key if we want to make progress on raising complaints and dealing with these complaints. Some basic requirements when we set up a complaint system, and maybe specific challenges, will really be at the start, and I think Ruby will speak a bit more about that, is actually to define what is a complaint and what is the scope of my complaint system. There can be limits to a complaint system. We cannot necessarily address all the issues, depending on what is the origin of the issue. So it is important, it's clear what is a complaint for our organization and what is the scope of our mechanism. What is also important is that we decide on the management system, and I'll come back to all these issues just after it, and that we have a clear procedure on how we make decisions when we get complaints, what happens, who takes which decision at which level. In the CRM, we also need to address, obviously, whistleblowing. So just to remind all of us what we mean by whistleblowing. Whistleblowing is when a third party actually raises a complaint not on their own behalf, but through observation, suspicion, or on behalf of one of the survivors. That's when we speak about whistleblowing. And obviously it's important that we have a policy in place to protect whistleblowers from potential retaliation. What we also need to cover in our complaints procedure is everything linked to anonymous complaints. Do we accept them or not? How do we deal with them? What might be the challenges to deal with them? Communication on complaints and communication on the system is, again, extremely important. We go back to the transparency principle. We need to communicate about how our procedure, how our policy works, and we also need to communicate on complaints we have received, and we will come back to this just in a couple of minutes. And obviously, the complaints mechanism needs to include disciplinary follow-up and follow-up actions, so that we are clear what actions might follow a complaint which has been dealt with, handled, investigated. So, definition of a complaint. Can I ask you to use the chat box and tell us how you define a complaint? How do you define a complaint, maybe generally, and how do you define a complaint for your own organization? Anybody? Any issue regarding an organization or an employee? Disagreement of a person with behavior or services, a concern, an expression of dissatisfaction. Okay. Sakia again, yes, complaint is satisfaction or concern. Excellent. So it's the dissatisfaction from beneficiary. It's dissatisfaction from any services or product. Good. Okay. So globally, when we say what is a complaint, we actually, and we have this on your answers, this is the expression of a dissatisfaction. Somebody is unhappy about something. Now, what is interesting is move to our own organization and say for our organization, a complaint for our organization is actually the expression of dissatisfaction about our stated commitments. So not just about anything, but clearly linked to our own policies, programs, commitments, obligations. And again, we need to, of course, communicate and raise awareness on what are our commitments so that people can see if we fulfill them. So this is the difference between generally a complaint and a complaint for our organization. It needs to be linked to our own commitments and of course needs to be linked to our staff and employees. I've spoken before about management systems, so let me quickly go back to a bit more in detail on management system. Organizations, when we set up a complaints mechanism, we need to also set up a whole management system on how we deal with complaints. So very often organizations will have a committee, and this committee can be internal or external to the organization, can be permanent or partially renewed, can include staff or experts, but what the committee does is take decisions on when we receive a complaint. Is this a complaint? Yes or not? Do we need to investigate this complaint? Yes or not? What's the procedure we're going to follow? On the other side, we have focal points very often, focal points, complaints focal points, or PSCA focal points, or safeguarding focal points, depending a little bit on the different organizations. Very often in charge of training and awareness raising, and very often involved in logistics for complaints handling. But they are not usually the ones who will take decisions on a complaint or on an investigation. This will be up to the committee. And of course, what is important to have in place is, I usually like to call it a decision-making tree with responsibilities, to say who is responsible of which part and how do we make decisions. How do we, for example, make the decision, yes or no, this is a complaint, yes or no, we're going to investigate it. It is good to be clear in a procedure how these decisions are taken so that we can guarantee it's formal and it's always done the same way. And I'm just looking at your comments and I can see Gulmurad saying the term of complaint response mechanism is not a good term, in my opinion, for stakeholders. We can call complaint and feedback mechanism or feedback and reporting mechanism, because we should not focus on complaint. Beneficiaries may have good feedback or suggestion to improve our quality program. For sure, Gulmurad, that is a very internal decision to to a lot of organizations how you actually call it, and maybe very much also linked to the cultural context. What we need to not forget is that a complaint is not a feedback. At one point, a complaint, we should call it a complaint, because when we specifically talk about sensitive complaints, sexual exploitation and abuse, for example, we really want to underline and acknowledge that this is actually a complaint and not anymore a feedback. Good. Now, what couple of challenges maybe we want to speak about is first of all the challenge of anonymous complaints. There are certainly some issues with anonymous complaints. It's not easy. Can I ask you, what do you see as challenges when we're accepting anonymous complaints? What would be some key difficulties or challenges when a complaint is anonymous? Any idea from the participants? Yes, thank you, Nabil Ali. Verifying its authenticity, to whom we respond. Yes, very good point. Exactly, complaints which might not be of good faith or maybe malicious, how to respond. Exactly. So there's a number of issues linked to this. It can also be that we have a lack of information. We can have potentially not sufficient information in an anonymous complaint to even decide if that needs to be investigated. So then if it's anonymous, we have nobody to go back and clarify. So lack of information, there is certainly a risk of malicious complaints, as you were saying. And obviously it will be difficult to feed back to the person about the outcome because we don't know who that is. So there's a number of issues on receiving anonymous complaints. So again, some organizations decide not to receive them. But if that is the case, then this needs to be very clear in the policy. It is, however, good practice to accept also anonymous complaints, but being quite transparent on that there is a certain limitation of how we can deal with them. Another challenging issue is the issue around whistleblowers. So what is one of the challenges maybe when we get a complaint from a whistleblower? Any difficulties you see with having complaints from whistleblowers? Trust issues. Okay. The whistleblower might get into trouble. Thank you, Irma. So that goes back to anonymity, doesn't it? Personal biases might be included in the complaint for sure. Protection of the whistleblower. Excellent, yeah. Again, protection. So yes, all very important. And of course, because this is a third party and not the victim, there is actually a risk or a possibility that the victim, the survivor, is denying what was reported through the whistleblower for many, many reasons. Not necessarily because it did not happen, but just because they don't want to report it. So that can be quite a tricky situation. And of course, again, confidentiality issues linked directly to the risk of retaliation against whistleblowers. And as Mohammed says, reprisal, of course, yes, when management officials take an unfavorable personal action against the individual. Exactly. So that unfortunately can happen against whistleblowers, can happen also against survivors or other witnesses. And this is why it is important that we do have whistleblowing and non-retaliation policies and procedures. Good. There may be some last additional issues which we need to cover in our complaints system is the topic of communication. How do we communicate about the system, the procedures, the complaints themselves, the results of investigations? We will have another webinar in a couple of weeks exactly about that topic on communication. Important that we link our complaints system to disciplinary action. What will happen if somebody is not following our rules and is actually the finding of the investigation of a complaint to confirm the facts? Then it is important that there is a link to disciplinary action and what will happen to the subject of the complaint. And of course, something also to address is complaints within communities. What happens to complaints from the community, but against a community member, so not linked to the organization? As we've seen in the definition, this is not a complaint for the organization, but still it is good to think through what we will do with this kind of complaints. Excellent. So let me stop here. And while I'm going to look at your question and answer, I've seen there's quite a few questions and answers. I think I want to give the floor to Ruby so that you can pick up on a more personalized presentation on your experience with ActionAid. Unfortunately, I think we lost Vermont from Caritas. So if it's fine for you, Ruby, if you can go ahead with your contribution.
Yes, of course. I'll put my camera on briefly just to say hello to you all. Greetings from a very cold UK. I'll turn it off now and share my slides. Just to confirm that you can see those.
Yeah, we can see them.
I'm trying to put them onto, there we go. Hopefully that's still clear for you. I won't be able to see the chat as I present, but please do let me know if there's any questions or comments coming up that it's important for me to talk through as I go ahead. So yes, as Esther said, my name's Ruby Mashenska and I'm the Global Safeguarding Lead at ActionAid International. So I'll just talk to you for a few minutes today around some of the values and the principles that we've tried to take when thinking about complaints mechanisms. And I want to really emphasize we are on this journey as well. This is something we are developing. We're always trying to strengthen it too. So I really look forward to your feedback, your ideas. I always feel with safeguarding that the stronger we all are, the better. So any feedback or any complaints you want to raise, I'd be very happy to hear them. Just briefly, and don't worry, an agenda doesn't mean I'll be talking forever. I'll be giving just a few ideas around core principles as we see it on developing complaints mechanisms. Talk a little bit around building internal and external complaints mechanisms and some ideas and things to consider when doing that. And then finally, and perhaps most importantly, what it means to create a working culture that promotes raising complaints and is safe for people to raise concerns. So some key principles for complaints mechanisms, and I could have done about 50 slides on this. There are so many principles, so many things to consider when setting up and managing complaints mechanisms. And I've spoken to a lot of these: confidentiality, the right for people to report, to have information about how to report. So I won't go too much in depth into all of those. And I'll just share some of the top ones I was thinking about that I think if we don't have these, it can be much harder for people to raise concerns and much harder for us to manage them safely. So one of the key things we've learned at ActionAid, a one-size-fits-all approach does not work. And very often it's easy to make complaints mechanisms a bit of a tick box exercise. We can say it's fine, you know, we have a complaints box in this village, everything's okay. And we don't recognize that actually we need to look much more context to context, space to space to see what's going to work for people. And one thing we've definitely learned, and I'll talk more about this shortly, is the need to have lots and lots of ways that people can raise a complaint. One way just isn't enough. Another key principle, the priority is the complainant. It's not us, it's not the organization. So one thing I see often, I think, in complaints mechanisms that are set up is that they are designed to make it really easy for the organization to check them, to assess them, to follow up. And of course, we want processes to be simple and straightforward for us as well. But the priority has to be that the complainant can easily raise a concern and that we make it as easy for them as possible. There are lots of reasons for this. I mean, I could talk for a long time around all the barriers that there are to reporting. I'm sure you've all discussed this previously. There are so many barriers to people raising a concern. We have to make sure that our complaints mechanisms don't become another barrier. Number 3, safeguarding that excludes anyone is not good safeguarding. So what are we doing to make sure that our approaches are inclusive, are accessible, as Esther was saying, they are adaptable, they work for different contexts, they work for different people. If we are excluding anyone, and often we do this without realizing it, sort of unthinkingly, the safeguarding work we do is not going to be safe. Number 4, and I'll come back to this, people want to report to someone they know. And this is something I've seen over and over again in the safeguarding work that I've done. It's really important to have complaints mechanisms, and I'll go into this in just a moment, so complaints boxes or systems or phone, whatever it might be. But I find that very often what someone wants to do if they're reporting about safeguarding is to talk to someone they know and trust. Talking about a safeguarding complaint, talking about any kind of experience of sexual abuse, of harm in that way is incredibly sensitive. And so having someone that they know and trust to talk to makes a huge difference. And finally, and I'll come back to this at the end when we talk about organizational culture, a strong complaints management approach doesn't stop with safeguarding. And it's incredibly important to create an organizational culture where people can raise concerns in all kinds of areas. That takes time, it takes a lot of commitment, and I'll talk about that more later on. Starting first of all with external complaints mechanisms. Pulled out some of the kind of top types that you see often of complaints mechanisms. I won't go too much in depth on these. I'm sure you all have lots of experience on these. You see them, you're probably developing them yourselves. So I'll just speak briefly on them. So we have the community complaints boxes that I mentioned. So physical boxes where people provide feedback. And I think in some ways they might be some of the most common ones that we see. SMS and hotlines, so complaints that can be shared via text or phone. And there's lots of positives to this as well. The feedback can be very, very quick, so there's no delay. The third option, no dial or low tech options. These can be really, really important in areas where there's perhaps less mobile or cell phone access. And so reporting offline can happen. And help desks, so people can report to people often in the community and raise concerns to a person. All of these have positives and negatives. A complaints box, for example, it's very clear, it's very simple, but a challenge I think we often see with them is that they are placed often in the middle of a community. And if someone is raising a complaint, particularly a safeguarding one, they need it to be confidential. And if they are seen by others to be walking over to a complaints box and putting something in, people will talk, people will know. So there is a huge challenge there.
Ruby, can I just interrupt you 1 second? Because
yes, of course.
If you can slow down a little bit.
Yes, of course, no problem.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. No problem. It's a bad habit I have. So thanks everyone. If I start to speed up again, I get so excited talking about safeguarding. Just let me know. Thanks, Esther.
No problem. Thanks.
So, and I'll say as well, I'm very happy to share these slides afterwards if that's helpful at all. So creating inclusive and accessible complaints mechanisms when working in communities. And I've just pulled out some key ideas and principles here, and I'll go through each one just briefly. So 1, ensure that all staff, partners, and communities are aware of why the complaint mechanism exists, how to use them, and how you as an organization will monitor them. As Esther was saying before, transparency is absolutely critical here. So often in safeguarding, so much of it needs to be confidential that I think we get confused in organizations and we assume everything has to be very, very confidential. And actually, the more that we can be transparent about, the better. If I want to raise a complaint about something, and as I was saying, doing that about safeguarding is very anxiety inducing for people, I would want to know who's receiving it, who else are they going to talk to, what's going to happen step by step, what time frame, what could happen to me, what support is available for me. It is the right of everyone, I believe, not just to have a place that they can raise a complaint, but to have information about it from beginning to end. What will happen if they raise a complaint? What could the next steps be? As I said before, having a variety of mechanisms available. It could be that using all the 4 options I showed above are really useful here. It could be that in one community, one of those versions is going to be great, and actually the other ones won't be useful at all. You'll know far better than I will what's going to work where you work. A really important one, the next one that I think we often skip, is working with communities to develop complaints mechanisms. And as part of that, to work with them to risk assess and to map needs. And this is part of ensuring that the mechanisms you create are accessible to everyone. And particularly, I think, to groups who are traditionally excluded or marginalized in different communities. So the example I've given here is people with disabilities. But again, community to community, this will look very different. I think increasingly in our sector, we are getting better at working with communities on these kinds of things. We can always do better. And we also want to make sure that the community members we work with are not gatekeepers in negative ways, and that we are not prevented from accessing people who really need support. Linked to this, and I won't go too much in depth on this next one here. I know you'll be having more sessions on complaints management, but ensuring that there is an agreed process to checking and responding to complaints. And this again goes back to the first point around that commitment to being really transparent about our processes and to having a really clear, strong process in place. Another one, to work with children and young people to develop complaints mechanisms that are relevant to them. Very often, I think that can be an afterthought. And actually, we're seeing some really, really interesting work being done across the sector to work with children and young people on this area. And linked to this as well, to ensure that there are complaints mechanisms developed with and for people with diverse literacy capabilities and communities with oral traditions. So this goes back to my third point, really making sure these are accessible to the people we want to hear from. It's not enough to say we have a complaints mechanism. Is it accessible? Do people know how they work? Do people trust the system? Working with your colleagues and with partners to develop complaints mechanisms. I'll just speak briefly on this. And this in a way is much more around generally collaborative behavior and how important that is in safeguarding. So this is about co-developing complaints mechanisms and having that really strong collaborative approach. Ensuring that the colleagues and partners that you work with can generally raise problems with you. I find very often is that there's an assumption that we will go from nothing and no discussion of problems to suddenly people being able to raise very serious safeguarding concerns. That's asking a lot of people, and usually that will mean you hear nothing. So what can you do to make sure that generally there can be discussions about problems or challenges that are dealt with really positively, that are met well? And the more that we can do that, that will then encourage people to raise concerns like safeguarding as well. Of course, safeguarding is not just about compliance. And I think very often we get stuck in our sector of talking about safeguarding in relation to, have you put this process in place? Do you have this there? Those things matter, of course they do, but we have to have this values and this principles discussion as well. And the final point goes generally when thinking about complaints mechanisms, continually encourage people to report. It sounds like you're having future sessions on communication, which is great. It's absolutely critical here. You could have the most perfect, beautiful complaints mechanism in the world. If people don't know about it, if they don't trust it, they will not use it. Briefly moving then to internal complaints mechanisms. Talk a little bit about some of the principles building from what Esther was saying, and I'll give just an example of what we do at ActionAid. So exactly as Esther was saying before, there are some really, really key principles you have to have in place. Confidentiality, the right for people to report anonymously if they want to. Now, the key thing very often in our internal policies is mandatory reporting, that people internally, our staff, other representatives, have to report a concern if they see something. What we've said at ActionAid, and I think many other organizations do this as well, is we've said, if you as a staff member of ActionAid witness or suspect that a safeguarding harm is taking place, you have to report. However, if you yourself have personally experienced something, you do not have to report that. So this is part of our survivor-centered approach, and not forcing people to come forward about something they've experienced if they don't want to. We hope they will. We will, of course, support them if they do, but it's up to them to decide if, when, and how they report on their own experience. So just some of these principles for internal complaints mechanisms. Again, have really clear systems outlined. Very often we get very complex systems and processes and policies that look incredibly complicated. The simpler, the better. As I said before, communicate these regularly. You cannot do this as one and then done. Often I hear someone saying to me, it's fine, we've done a safeguarding training last year, everything's okay. No, you have to talk about safeguarding all the time. It needs to be something that everyone feels comfortable and familiar with. And as I was saying, be really transparent about what the process is going to be. I know in any training that I do, that I am talking to potential complainants, to potential witnesses, to potential perpetrators. Everyone has the right to know what our process is and why we do that. Just briefly, this is how we try and show it at ActionAid, and how someone can raise a concern. So internally in each ActionAid country, they can go to their focal point, their country director, HR, their line manager. They can also come separately to the secretariat that I sit in, either to the safeguarding team or to the whistleblowing service as well. So again, trying to have a variety of options. What I haven't shown here, but is a part of this as well, is that under all of this, we then come back together. Whoever it comes to, there's a focused way that we then manage and assess those complaints. But we wanted to make this part as broad and easy for people to raise concerns as possible. As I said earlier, the kind of key point that I really want to sort of emphasize here is that people do want to report to someone they know. So alongside having these different mechanisms that I've mentioned, the one thing I would strongly recommend is that training for people on what it's like to receive a complaint, how to respond to someone the first time they come and talk to you or disclose to you a safeguarding issue. Not judgmental, that we listen to them, that we are encouraging, that we support them. I think that can take specialized training for designated safeguarding staff. That might be focal points, that might be designated safeguarding staff members. I think training for all staff is critical. People can disclose a safeguarding case at any time. And of course, specific training for leadership as well. And I'll talk more about that now. Briefly, I know I'm coming close to the end of the time, and I hope there are questions. I'll just speak briefly on this, but the importance of creating that working culture where anyone can safely raise a concern or a complaint. Part of this is having that really strong leadership that is committed to this, leadership that promotes and resources safeguarding and other integrity areas. As I was saying, safeguarding can't be done in a vacuum. It has to connect to other work as well. Need leadership that actively encourages complaints in all areas, and line managers who are trained on giving and receiving feedback. And I feel very strongly that if we're not encouraging people generally to give feedback on work or what someone was like in a meeting or how to manage this issue, if we're not able to have those general conversations and manage feedback safely and respectfully generally, it's incredibly hard for someone to raise a safeguarding complaint. So part of it is about leadership, but there's work that we can all do as well. And this really is about walking the talk. So again, having policies that outline exactly how people can raise concerns, that explicitly encourage people to report, and also condemns any retribution towards complainants. And there were some really good examples in the chat earlier about the risks to whistleblowers that people were highlighting. That's absolutely right. It's critical to have in your policies and in your processes what action will be taken if someone suffers because they've raised a complaint. And we have to hold people to account there. And finally, consistency. It's incredibly important in this work, I think, to help build that trust and commitment to safeguarding. If someone knows of a safeguarding case that wasn't dealt with or was ignored, wasn't addressed properly, that ripple effect is incredibly powerful. People will not come forward about future cases. They will not trust the system. So be consistent, take action on any case that comes to you. I had just some final key messages, but I'll share these separately in the presentation slides, and I'll pause here in case there are any.
Thank you very much, Ruby. Lots and lots of interesting information, and really thank you for what you said on training people on how to listen to people, because I think that is actually a key issue we don't always take into account. Is when we receive complaints, it is so important when they're done in people need to have a trusty environment. If they come forward with very sensitive issues, it can all depend on the person who will receive them and listen to them, and how much empathy and how much understanding this person shows without taking sides or being biased, but still how serious and how well this person will receive the complaint and deal with it well. That is key to build that trust so that people do come forward. So I think training on this is really, really key. Thank you, Ruby, for reminding us of this. So there are quite some questions. Maybe we want to just start with asking any specific questions for Ruby. Besides that, yes, we will share the records on our website, and we will share the presentation as well. And Ruby, I think you will send us your presentation so that we can share it as well. There's a lot of information on these slides, which are really useful, I think, and we'll want to read them again. Any specific questions to Ruby on the different points she's shared? Yeah, thank you. Now raise your hand. While somebody raises your hand, I might just go back to some points which were raised in the questions and answers. So there was a question on reporting back, feeding back on complaints. And yes, organizations do not always feed back on complaints. Obviously, there is confidentiality issues. But what is important is that at least the person who has raised the complaint, the complainant, survivor, and of course the person who is the subject of the complaint, need to know the outcome. They need to know it's dealt with, and there has been a finding, a result, an outcome. That is really important, because otherwise people have the impression that they do raise a complaint and nothing happens. So it is important on a needs to know basis to really let people know what happened. And some organizations do actually give public feedback once a year on the number of complaints they received, the number of sensitive complaints, and how they were resolved. Okay, now Abdul Hasib is having a question. Could you elaborate a few key differences between CRM and feedback mechanism? So before I give the word to you, maybe Ruby, just to say, there was earlier somebody saying it is so important that we have the response. Yes, totally agree with this. That's actually why initially the CRM stands for complaints and response mechanism. Over time, people have called it differently, but in any case, we need to have a response. And even if the response is to say, we're sorry, this is not a complaint for us, or we're sorry, this was not substantiated, this is also a response, and it's important to give these responses. And Ruby, anything to add on feedback and CRM, and what's the difference?
Thanks, Esther. Yeah, and thanks for the question. It's a really important one. And the difference I often see is that some general mechanisms are just about feedback, and they're incredibly important. And I think some of the comments earlier were saying we have to ensure that communities can generally give us feedback. That might be good feedback. We hope it is. It might also be more negative feedback. What I would say is if you're talking about safeguarding, I think it's very good to be very explicit about that. And this goes back to the transparency and the communication piece. Whatever you want to call it, CRM, CFM, whatever you choose, be really clear about what can be raised through that particular mechanism. Because I think often in feedback ones, it doesn't include safeguarding. Sometimes it does. So I think it's really up to you what language you choose. You just need to be clear about what's being included there.
Yeah, and I think maybe to add on to this, Ruby, there was just a question on somebody asking if there is a box and there is no complaints in the box, why? And I've been replying, well, first of all, it could be that there are no complaints. that can happen as well. But certainly if there is never a complaint in a box, then it might be that the box is in the wrong place. Somebody was mentioning in the chat that the example of a box which was somewhere where there was a camera, CCTV camera. So of course that doesn't help to build trust. It could be that people don't know how it works. They don't know what the box is for. I've seen that in Nepal, for example. People do often not know who will open the box, so they don't trust because they want to be sure that it's not the person whom they complain about, for example, who opens the box. It could be that it's the wrong language. It could be that there is high illiteracy and you have to write your complaint, so people feel less comfortable writing. So there can be many reasons, but for sure, if we have a box or whatever system and we never get any complaint, any feedback through that system, we really need to go back to basics and assess why. What is the reason why this is not used? Because obviously, if the system is not used, it is not useful to the communities and beneficiaries and whoever stakeholder would like to complain. And all this leads us back, and as thank you, Kwamarikpal, leads us back to trust and understanding for sure. There is another question for you, Ruby. Does ActionAid use the system of committee for reviewing and responding to feedback, or I suppose complaints? How effective is it? And sorry if I missed anything, as it was very quick. So maybe can you comment on the committee?
Yes, absolutely. It's a great question. We do. So the process we have at ActionAid, and all our policies are accessible on our website. And I'm happy to share my email as well in case anyone has any questions. So the system we put in place is that we have a safeguarding stakeholder panel in every country. So if a complaint comes in, it immediately goes up to that panel, no matter who it first comes to. It should come ideally to the focal point, who then brings that panel together and they discuss and work out what the next steps should be. They document all actions and they take different decisions. It could be, as Esther was saying earlier, sometimes you can't take action on a complaint. Sometimes it might actually not be a safeguarding matter. It needs to be funded elsewhere. But generally, if it can be managed as a safeguarding issue, it would be our safeguarding stakeholder panel who manage it. We then have different systems for an investigation. I won't go into that now, but yes, we do have that committee who manages it. And I do think, again, that's an important safety mechanism. Where it can be risky, I think, in organizations is if there is one person managing complaints. That is not a safe approach. And we try to talk very often about having a number of people who are monitoring and looking at this. You want to keep that number small, of course, for confidentiality reasons. But if, for example, someone wanted to raise a complaint about me, and I'm the only person who is accessing complaints, they are not going to be able to report about me. It's not safe. We have to be able to raise a concern about anyone. So having that committee and having at least a small number of trained staff managing complaints is really important.
Thank you very much, Ruby. Thanks. As usual, we could go on for another 3 hours. I think it is always a very interesting and passionate discussion when we speak about complaints, systems, complaining, barriers, etc. So can I, as our time is up, can I suggest that we'll be happy to continue the discussion with you. I think you will have our emails. So you are most welcome to ask follow-up questions also through this channel. what I would really like to use as a wrap up of this session is what somebody put on the chat, and I'm sorry, I don't remember who that was, but it was something really nice, saying, be transparent and accountable. It is easy to say that we are transparent and accountable, but it's very difficult to do. And I think that is a really, really, yeah, it's a nice resume of what we all try to do. It is not always easy to implement all what we want to do. There's a lot of challenges. I think the discussion is always helpful to help us address the challenges and to remember that we're all on the travel to a final destination we haven't reached yet, but talking together and trying to be transparent also about our challenges is hopefully contributing to, to make progress. So thanks a lot for all your comments, for all your questions, for all your contributions. It's always difficult because there are many people on the line, so we can't always give you sufficient space, but I hope this was useful. As usual, I thank you for your time. I will see you again on the 2nd of February to speak more about investigations and actually really handling those complaints. So thanks a lot for your participation. Thank you.
Thank you, Esther. Thank you, Ruby. Thank you for those wise words and for the really nice comment that you kind of summarized the session with today. I think that is key. That is very, very important to keep in mind. And yes, it is very easy to say, but it is very difficult to implement and act upon. And which is why we must keep on working on it and we must keep on learning on how to do it. And I think another important key takeaway for me was training people on how to listen to people. I think that is so important. I think that was one of my key takeaways from today's session. So thank you, Ruby, for that. Thank you to all of you participants for joining us today and for engaging with us throughout the session and raising some very meaningful questions. We really appreciate your participation. We will have another session on the 2nd of February this year on CRM. You will all get an invite for that. So, and in fact, you might already have received an invite for that. So please ensure you participate in that one, as it will focus on complaints management and investigations. And it is part of the same series. So you will learn more holistically about the processes and mechanisms of CRM. Like I said, we've already circulated that. So in case you haven't registered already, please go to the link and register. Thanks again. And we hope to see you in the next session. Take care, everybody. Khudafis.